Scar may have been a little nicer to the lions around him if he could make like Jefferson Airplane told us to and find somebody to love. Well, it turns out that Scar might have had a secret queen the entire time he was ruling over the Pridelands. We just didn't know it. While it could be just a theory, after looking into the history of the Lion King, it seems like Sarafina and Scar had a secret relationship before Simba returned to reclaim Pride Rock. How crazy is that? What's even crazier is that Nala might have actually had a brother that could have helped solidify this theory, if he had made it into the film, that is. That's right, when The Lion King was still being written and discussed by Disney, it turns out that they had plans to make Nala an older sister. This was during the point in the production that the name of the whole movie was still intended to be The King of the Jungle. According to reports by Disney, Linda Wolverton, the well-known screenwriter responsible for her work on multiple animated classics such as Beauty and the Beast as well as The Lion King, was hard at work developing this unseen character. Wolverton supposedly designed a character known as Mahitu, who was going to be Nala's younger brother. Now, what's really interesting is the fact that Mahitu's concept art had some features that made him seem oddly familiar. Unlike Nala, Mahitu was going to have much lighter fur coupled with a very dark and sharp-looking nose, a nose that honestly seemed quite similar to Scar's after taking a closer look at it. Some concepts of the young lion even had green eyes like Scar, which might indicate an intended connection that was deeper than you may think. Now, when it came to Mahitu's intended role in The Lion King, his whole purpose in the movie was going to be based around the motivation that Nala had someone she intensely needed to protect from Scar after the elder lion took over the Pridelands. The idea for Mahitu was ultimately dropped, though, because it was thought that adding a cub to the movie specifically to have him be bullied, hurt, or scared was seen as too dark for The Lion King. According to Linda Wolverton, after writing about Mufasa's death and the horrid state of the Pridelands, the movie was already dark enough. Mahitu would have just been overkill. But say Mahitu did make it into The Lion King, and what if Nala was protecting him from Scar for a less intimidating but more influential reason? Some Lion King fans have theorized that even though Scar didn't have an apparent queen at Pride Rock, he might not have been as lonely as we originally thought, seeing as he possibly had a family of his own, including Mahitu. There are actually multiple schools of thought with this theory, however all of them lead back to the idea that Scar and Sarafina were in a secret relationship, or at least a relationship that Disney never got around to showing on screen. The first school of thought is that much like back in the days of kings and queens, Scar and Sarafina may have had an arranged betrothal. When it came to marriage, for a time many rulers would use their children as peace treaties of sorts. The thinking was, oh, you have a prince in your kingdom and I have a princess in mine. If we don't want to go to war, then why don't we become one big family and force them to marry? It was a pretty dark concept, but considered totally normal, and I wouldn't put it past the kings of the Pridelands and the surrounding territories to participate in these marriage arrangements. Now, as for this theory, it suggests that Scar and Sarafina were betrothed to each other since they were young, and because of that, there's a chance that when he became the king, she became his off-screen queen, which in the end could have led to Sarafina saving Scar from becoming a true monster, though you'll see why that never actually happened. The other school of thought under this theory is that Scar and Sarafina didn't end up becoming romantically entangled until after Scar became a cold-blooded killer. After Scar killed Mufasa in The Lion King and took over as the leader of the Pride, there's a very good chance that he was the only male lion left. This means that in order to keep the Pride alive, someone, or possibly multiple someones, gross, would have had to reproduce with him. Well, since Sarafina knew Scar and possibly knew how to handle him, she decided to become his partner. Now, for the sake of things, let's say that one of these two situations is true, and Sarafina and Scar did end up with one another, whether it be after he killed Mufasa or not. How would it have been possible for Sarafina to have saved Scar? Well, aside from loving him and giving him the attention that he needed, it's possible that Scar and Sarafina had a cub together. As almost any parent in the world will tell you, having a kid changes you, and surely Scar would have seen the world at least somewhat differently if he had a cub of his own. I fear I'm getting a bit too ahead of myself, though. As I mentioned before, Scar and Sarafina may have gotten together in many different scenarios, such as them being betrothed when they were younger, or possibly after Scar took over the Pridelands as the evil dictator. Either way, according to this theory, Sarafina was the only reason that the hyenas and Scar didn't immediately destroy the Pridelands. I mean, we all know from The Lion King that the Pridelands were basically turned into the Shadowlands under Scar's reign, but odds are that didn't happen overnight. Scar held on up his end of the bargain with the hyenas and allowed them to hunt in the territory, but the Pridelands were in great shape when Mufasa was killed, meaning that there's a good chance it stayed strong, lively, and green at least for some time. Well, according to this theory, it almost stayed that way entirely solely based on the way that Sarafina would have treated Scar if the two were actually in love. This would have helped Scar develop emotions that he might not have been able to do on his own with no one to properly socialize with. The theory continues by explaining that Scar and Sarafina began to develop genuine feelings for one another, which in turn gave Scar a slightly more positive perspective on the world around him. This is where a character that was cut from the storyline could have really been used to help solidify the idea that Scar and Sarafina were in a relationship of sorts before Simba returned. But who could have that sort of influence on the storyline? Scar's potential heir, of course, Mehitu. As I mentioned before, Mehitu was a character in The Lion King who was intended to be Nala's brother, aka the son of Sarafina. Well, after looking at the similarities that the concept art of the cub had with Scar, I can see why some fans have theorized that Mehitu was his cub. Now, this may or may not mean that Scar was also Nala's father, but that's a whole other theory for another time. Right now, let's focus on Mehitu. Say the theory is accurate, and after Scar became the king of Pride Rock, he also started a relationship with Sarafina that led to the pair having a little cub of their own. This would mean that, in Mehitu, Scar officially had an heir of his own who could take over the throne after he inevitably passed on. And this is where the idea that Mehitu was designed as a character for Nala to protect from Scar ultimately comes into play. You see, as Scar's heir, the young lion would have had his father breathing down his neck and doing everything he could to influence him. But as you might expect, Nala would know that Scar's influence wasn't really the best thing for a young cub to follow, especially her own younger brother. This might have led to Nala being very protective of Mehitu, especially when it came to Scar, just not in a physical way. She very well could have been extremely concerned with what the villainous lion would have been able to do to her brother's impressionable mind. At the end of the day, though, it's unlikely Nala would have been able to stop Scar altogether. Interestingly enough, Scar also never had a real shot at happiness even if he did start a family with Sarafina. Do you know why? Simply put, because Simba returned. As weird as that sounds, according to this theory, there's a decent chance that the return of Simba to the Pridelands is what solidified Scar as a true villain and ultimately cost him everything, even his life. Think about it. Because if this theory is accurate, Scar and Sarafina would have found some semblance of happiness with one another, only to have that all washed away by the return of the lion who had a legitimate claim to the throne. This would leave Sarafina with two options. She could stand by Scar and tell Simba that he wasn't welcome back. However, that would essentially mean turning her back on the rest of the Pride, who immediately recognized Simba as their true king. Or she could join the rest of the Pride in a united front against Scar so that she could keep her place when the war for Pride Rock was over. Now, once again, there are basically two schools of thought when it comes to this theory. The first is that Sarafina didn't actually love Scar and was only trying to keep him from ruining the Pridelands faster than he already was. This would be sad because not only would it reinforce the idea that nobody loved Scar and he was always meant to be the lonely, villainous outcast. Then the other school of thought, which might be even worse, is that Sarafina developed real feelings for Scar and their little family. But in order to save herself and possibly even Nala from being labeled as outcasts, she decided to turn back on the lion she loved to ensure her place in Simba's pride. No matter how you look at it, it's a very unfortunate story for Scar, and even if he had managed to survive his fight with Simba, well, and the hyenas he betrayed right at the end, he likely did not have a happy life ahead of him. Now, as fellow Disney fans, I'm really curious to know what you think about this theory. Was Scar and Sarafina being together in a secret relationship the thing that almost kept Scar from joining the dark side? Also, what do you think about Nala's potential brother and Scar's potential son, Mehitu? If you'd like to see a full video on Mehitu and what may have happened to him, be sure to let me know in the comments below. I love hearing from all of you.